The day I found my mother-in-law hunched over my desk, rifling through our financial documents with latex gloves on her hands, was the day I finally had to accept what I'd suspected for months. The woman who had welcomed me into her family with open arms and homemade apple pie was methodically trying to destroy my marriage, but perhaps I should start at the beginning. My name is Eleanor Hayes, though everyone has called me Ellie since before I can remember. I met Daniel Mercer during my final year of graduate school while pursuing my master's in architectural design. He was giving a guest lecture on sustainable building practices, and I was immediately drawn to his passionate intelligence and the quiet confidence with which he commanded the room. When those thoughtful hazel eyes landed on me during the Q&A session, I felt a connection I couldn't explain. "You've clearly thought about the environmental impact," I said. "But what about the cultural implications of replacing traditional building methods in established communities? Doesn't sustainability also mean preserving heritage?" A smile spread across his face, the kind that reaches the eyes, and he nodded slowly. "That's precisely the question we should be asking. Would you mind expanding on that over coffee after this session?" Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into weekend hikes, and 6 months later, we were inseparable. Daniel was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: kind, brilliant, supportive, and utterly devoted to making the world better through his work. When he proposed a year later at the completion ceremony for my first major building project, I didn't hesitate to say yes. "My mother is going to absolutely adore you," Daniel said, as we drove to meet his family for the first time after our engagement. "She's been asking to meet the woman who finally captured my impossible son for months." I remember smoothing my skirt nervously. "What if she doesn't? Like me, I mean." Daniel laughed, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Trust me, Ellie. My mother is the warmest person you'll ever meet. She practically raised me on her own after Dad died. And she's my biggest supporter. She just wants me to be happy, and you make me happier than I've ever been." Vivian Mercer lived in a charming colonial in the Connecticut suburb where Daniel had grown up. When we pulled into the driveway, she was already waiting on the porch, arms outstretched. She was a small woman with Daniel's same hazel eyes and an elegant bearing that somehow made her casual slacks and blouse look like designer wear. "Finally," she exclaimed, pulling Daniel into a tight embrace before turning to me. "And you must be Eleanor. My wonderful boy has told me so much about you." Before I could respond, she had enveloped me in a hug that smelled of vanilla and expensive perfume. "Welcome to the family, my dear. I've been praying for years that Daniel would find someone special." That first weekend was perfect. Vivian had prepared all of Daniel's favorite foods, showed me family photo albums, and regaled me with stories of his childhood. She seemed genuinely interested in my work and my background, asking thoughtful questions and listening attentively to my answers. "An architect. How marvelous," she said over dinner. "I always wanted to do something creative, but life had other plans. We need more women in technical fields. Daniel, you've found yourself quite the catch." By the time we left on Sunday, I felt as though I'd known Vivian for years. She pressed a small box into my hands as we said goodbye. "A little engagement gift," she explained. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet. It was my grandmother's. I've been saving it for the woman my son would marry. I was touched by the gesture, by her immediate acceptance of me into their family circle. On the drive home, I told Daniel how lucky he was to have such a supportive mother. "I told you she'd love you," he said, looking pleased. "Mom's been my rock my whole life. I can't wait for you two to get closer." The wedding planning began in earnest after that, and Vivian was an enthusiastic participant. She had suggestions for everything: venues, flowers, menu options, but always deferred to my preferences. "It's your day, Eleanor dear," she would say. "I'm just happy to help however I can." When I expressed concern about costs, Vivian insisted on contributing a substantial amount. Daniel is my only child, she explained. I've been saving for his wedding since he was born. Please, let me do this for you both. Daniel and I were married the following spring in a beautiful ceremony, followed by a reception at a historic hotel overlooking the harbor. Vivian was radiant that day, helping me with my dress and keeping everything running smoothly. As we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, she hugged me tightly. "Take care of my boy," she whispered. "And remember, family comes first. Always." I didn't think much of those words at the time. They seemed like the natural sentiment of a mother on her son's wedding day. I had no idea they were actually the first warning of what was to come. The initial months of marriage were blissful. Daniel and I settled into a renovated brownstone in the city, close enough to both our workplaces that we could occasionally meet for lunch. His architectural consulting firm was expanding, and I had recently been promoted at my firm. We were busy but fulfilled, making time for each other despite our hectic schedules. Vivian visited regularly, always bringing thoughtful gifts and offering to help around the house. She would stock our refrigerator with homemade meals, claiming she worried we weren't eating properly with our demanding careers. "You're both working so hard," she would say. "The last thing you need to worry about is cooking." It was during these visits that I began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. Nothing I could definitively point to, just small moments that left me slightly unsettled. The way she would rearrange our furniture while I was at work, claiming she was just making things more functional. How she referred to certain design choices in our home as Eleanor's interesting ideas, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The frequency with which she reminded Daniel of childhood traditions and family obligations. "Remember how we always spent Memorial Day at the lake house?" she would say. "Your father would be so disappointed if we broke that tradition." When I mentioned these observations to Daniel, he laughed gently. "That's just Mom," he explained. "She's set in her ways, but she means well. She's always been a bit of a perfectionist." I accepted his explanation. After all, he knew his mother far better than I did, and nothing she had done was objectively problematic. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive, still adjusting to being part of a new family with its own dynamics and expectations. 6 months into our marriage, I received an exciting opportunity. A chance to lead the design team for a sustainable community center in Portland. It would mean traveling to Oregon frequently over the next year, but it was exactly the kind of project I had dreamed of working on. "This is amazing, Ellie," Daniel exclaimed when I told him. "Of course you have to take it. We'll make it work with the travel." Vivian's reaction was markedly different. When we shared the news over Sunday dinner at her house, a smile froze. "But what about your responsibilities here?" she asked. "Surely there are projects locally that wouldn't take you away from home so often." "This is a career-defining opportunity," I explained. "The travel will be challenging, but Daniel and I have discussed it." "Well," she said, her voice tight, "I suppose modern marriages are different. In my day, wives prioritized their husbands and building a home." Daniel jumped in quickly. "Mom, Ellie's career is important to both of us. I'm incredibly proud of her accomplishment." Vivian patted his hand. "Of course you are, dear. I just worry about you being alone so much. Perhaps you should stay with me when Eleanor is traveling. No sense rattling around in that big house by yourself." That was the first clear red flag. There was nothing inherently wrong with her suggestion, but something in her tone, the slight emphasis on Eleanor, as if it were a foreign word, the immediate assumption that Daniel would need taking care of in my absence, set off alarm bells. On the drive home, I carefully broached the subject. "Your mother seemed upset about the Portland project." Daniel sighed. "She's from a different generation, and she worries about me, probably too much. She had to be both parents after Dad died, and I think she never quite stopped seeing me as her responsibility." "I understand that," I said, "but I felt like she was suggesting I was abandoning you by pursuing this project." "She didn't mean it that way," Daniel assured me. Mom will come around once she sees how well we manage. Give her time. I nodded, wanting to believe him but unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Vivian. The warm, supportive woman who had welcomed me so enthusiastically was being replaced by someone more controlling, more critical of my choices. What I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. The Portland project would become the catalyst for revealing Vivian Mercer's true nature, and the lengths she would go to maintain her position as the most important woman in her son's life. My first trip to Portland was scheduled for mid-October, a 10-day initial consultation with a client and local stakeholders. Daniel drove me to the airport, promising to call every evening and reminding me how proud he was. "Knock 'em dead," he said, kissing me goodbye. "Show them what Eleanor Mercer can do." I called him that evening from my hotel room, and we chatted about my preliminary meetings and his day at the office. Everything seemed normal until he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his mother had dropped by with dinner. "She brought that lasagna I love," he said. "Said she was worried I'd be living on takeout while you were gone." "That was thoughtful," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "She's staying for breakfast tomorrow too," Daniel continued. "Wants to make sure I'm eating properly before work." By the 4th day of my trip, Vivian had effectively moved into our home. Daniel mentioned casually that she was just spending a few nights to keep him company. When I returned, I found evidence of her presence everywhere. Her favorite coffee mugs in our dishwasher, a cardigan draped over our bedroom chair, her toiletries arranged neatly in our guest bathroom. More disturbing were the subtle changes to our home. The living room furniture had been rearranged to improve conversation flow. The paintings I had carefully selected had been rehung at the proper height. The refrigerator was stocked with prepared meals in labeled containers with detailed reheating instructions. "Your mother was certainly busy while I was gone," I observed as Daniel, and I unpacked my suitcase. "She was trying to help," he said. "I know she can be a bit overwhelming, but she means well." I let it go, not wanting to create tension when I had just returned. But the pattern continued with each subsequent trip to Portland. Vivian would arrive at our house within hours of my departure and leave reluctantly when I returned. Each time, more of our home bore her imprint, from the arrangement of kitchen cabinets to the selection of guest towels. During a rare Sunday when Vivian had other obligations, I broached the subject with Daniel. "I appreciate your mother wanting to keep you company when I travel, but I'm uncomfortable with how much she's changing in our home." Daniel looked surprised. "What do you mean?" I gestured around us. "Daniel, she's rearranged every room, replaced our kitchen organization system, and even changed the settings on our thermostat. This doesn't feel like our space anymore. She's just trying to make things more efficient," he said defensively. "Mom has always been good at organizing." "That's not the point," I insisted. "This is our home. We should decide how it's arranged, not your mother." He sighed. "You're right. I'll talk to her about it." But whatever conversation they had made little difference. If anything, Vivian became more subtle in her changes, but no less persistent. And she began to employ a new strategy, creating situations that required Daniel's attention whenever I returned from a trip. The first time it happened, I had just arrived home from a particularly challenging week in Portland. I was exhausted and looking forward to reconnecting with my husband. Instead, I found him preparing to leave. "Mom's having trouble with her heating system," he explained apologetically. "I need to go check it out before the temperatures drop tonight. You understand, right?" Of course I understood. I wouldn't want Vivian to be without heat. But similar emergencies began to occur with suspicious regularity, always when I had just returned home or when Daniel and I had planned special time together. The timing became too consistent to be coincidental. A plumbing issue the evening of our anniversary dinner. A possible gas leak the weekend we had planned a short getaway. a fallen tree branch on her car, when we were hosting friends for dinner. When I gently pointed out the pattern to Daniel, he became defensive. "Are you suggesting my mother is making these things up? That's ridiculous, Ellie." "I'm not saying they're not happening," I clarified. "Just that the timing is remarkably consistent." "She's an older woman living alone in a big house," Daniel replied. "Things are bound to go wrong sometimes. Would you prefer I ignored her needs?" "Of course not. She's my mother, Ellie. She was there for me my entire life. I can't turn my back on her now." And there it was, the unfair dichotomy that Vivian had masterfully created. Either Daniel was a good son who responded to his widowed mother's needs, or he was neglectful and ungrateful. There was no middle ground, no recognition that boundaries could exist alongside familial responsibility. I retreated from the conversation, not wanting it to escalate further. But I began to pay closer attention to Vivian's behavior, particularly when the three of us were together. What I observed was troubling. She would frequently reminisce about Daniel's childhood, telling stories that pointedly excluded me. "Remember that summer at Lake George, darling? Just the two of us after your father died? We've always been quite the team, haven't we?" She had a talent for subtle undermining comments, disguised as compliments or concerns. "Eleanor, that blouse is so youthful on you. I could never pull that off at my age." Or, "Daniel always valued punctuality before. I suppose schedules are more flexible now." Most concerning was how she monopolized Daniel's attention whenever possible. Phone calls during our dinner time. Health scares that required immediate consultation. Last-minute invitations to events that she claimed had slipped her mind. The Portland project was scheduled to last 12 months, but after 9 months of this pattern, I was emotionally exhausted. The project itself was going brilliantly. My design had been enthusiastically received, and the implementation was proceeding ahead of schedule, but my marriage was showing signs of strain. Daniel and I were arguing more frequently, often about his mother, but increasingly about other things as well. The ease and connection we had once shared was being eroded by tension and unspoken resentments. I found myself dreading my returns home almost as much as my departures. Then came the incident that could not be dismissed or explained away. I had returned a day early from Portland, hoping to surprise Daniel. When I arrived home in the early afternoon, I was startled to find Vivian in our bedroom, methodically going through my closet. "Vivian," I exclaimed, "what are you doing?" She turned, momentarily flustered before composing herself. "Eleanor, you're back early. I was just organizing your clothing by color and season. Your closet was such a jumble, and I know how busy you are." I stared at her, taking in the scene. My personal items were spread across the bed, jewelry, scarves, even the memory box where I kept letters from my late father. This wasn't organization. This was invasion. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I prefer to manage my own belongings." "Of course, dear," she replied smoothly. "I was only trying to help. Daniel mentioned you've been so overwhelmed lately. I worry about the pressure you're under with this Portland business. Daniel discussed my emotional state with you. The idea stung more than I expected." "We talk about everything," Vivian said with a small smile. "He's concerned about you, Eleanor. We both are. All these flights, the stress of your job. It's a lot for anyone to handle. Perhaps when this project is finished, you might consider something less demanding, for the sake of your marriage." The implication was clear. My career was damaging my relationship with Daniel, and Vivian was positioning herself as the concerned mediator rather than the source of the problem. I maintained my composure until she left, then sat heavily on the edge of the bed, surrounded by my displaced possessions. This wasn't normal mother-in-law behavior. This was calculated interference in my marriage and my life. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a troubling possibility. What if Vivian wasn't just overprotective or old-fashioned? What if she was deliberately trying to create distance between Daniel and me? The thought was disturbing but increasingly difficult to dismiss, and as I would soon discover, I had only glimpsed the tip of a much larger iceberg of manipulation and deceit. After finding Vivian in our bedroom, I knew I needed to approach the situation differently. Emotional reactions and vague concerns hadn't been effective. Daniel was too deeply enmeshed in his mother's influence to recognize the patterns I was seeing. If I wanted to address the problem, I would need concrete evidence. I began by documenting everything. Each emergency that interrupted our time together, each undermining comment, each boundary violation. I created a password-protected document on my laptop, adding entries with dates, descriptions, and context. Seeing these incidents compiled chronologically made the pattern unmistakable, but I knew Daniel would need more than my word against his mother's. The Portland project was entering its final phase, requiring fewer trips and shorter stays. I used this transition to suggest changes to our routine. Since I'll be home more, I think we should establish some boundaries with your mother, I said carefully. I miss our privacy and time together. Daniel seemed receptive. What did you have in mind? For starters, I think we should be the only ones with keys to our house, I suggested. It's not that I don't want your mother to visit, but I'm uncomfortable with her coming and going when we're not here. To my surprise, Daniel agreed without argument. That's reasonable. I'll talk to her. This small victory gave me hope, but it was short-lived. The following week, I returned from a brief site visit to find clear evidence that Vivian had been in our home despite not having a key. Nothing obvious, just her distinctive perfume lingering in our living room and a casserole in our refrigerator that hadn't been there when I left. When I confronted Daniel, he looked uncomfortable. Mom stopped by to drop off dinner. I mentioned you were away overnight, and she offered to make something for when you got back. And how did she get in? We agreed she wouldn't have a key anymore. You wouldn't meet my eyes. I gave her the spare from my office, just temporarily. Daniel, we specifically agreed. She's my mother, Ellie. What was I supposed to do? Tell her she's not welcome in our home. The conversation devolved from there, ending with Daniel sleeping in the guest room. But it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Direct confrontation about Vivian would only push Daniel further away. I needed a different approach. I decided to focus on strengthening our marriage instead of directly addressing the Vivian problem. I arranged date nights, weekend getaways, and activities that reminded us of our early relationship. Sometimes these plans were mysteriously interrupted by Vivian's emergencies, but I documented each instance without comment. I also began to engage more directly with Vivian, volunteering to help with projects at her house or inviting her to lunch, just the two of us. These interactions were enlightening. When Daniel wasn't present, her mask occasionally slipped, revealing flashes of the resentment she harbored toward me. During one such lunch, I mentioned our plans to begin trying for a baby in the coming year. Vivian's reaction was immediate and visceral, a momentary widening of the eyes, a tightening of her grip on her water glass. Children are such a commitment, she said finally. They change everything. Are you certain your career can accommodate motherhood? Daniel always envisioned a traditional family with a mother who was present. Daniel and I have discussed this extensively, I replied calmly. We both want children, and we both plan to continue our careers. He's actually excited about being a hands-on father. Her smile was brittle. Well, you certainly know my son's thoughts better than his mother who raised him. The conversation moved on, but that moment of naked displeasure had been revealing. The prospect of a grandchild, a new focus for Daniel's attention and affection, clearly threatened her. It was the first time I fully understood that Vivian's behavior wasn't just about maintaining her role in Daniel's life. It was about preventing anyone else from establishing a competing claim. As the Portland project neared completion An unexpected development provided the breakthrough I had been waiting for. My firm's senior partner called me into his office to deliver surprising news. "Eleanor, we've received a concerning phone call about you," he began. "A woman identifying herself as a former client contacted us with allegations about your professional conduct during the Portland project." My stomach dropped. "What allegations?" "She claimed you've been misrepresenting your role on the project, taking credit for others' work, and that there have been significant cost overruns due to your design changes." He held up a hand as I began to protest. "We know these claims are false. The Portland clients have been effusive about your work, and the project is actually under budget. What concerns me is who might be making these accusations and why." I had a sickening suspicion. Did this woman give her name? She claimed to be Catherine Watson from the Portland Housing Authority. When we checked, no such person exists in their organization. I took a deep breath. I believe it might have been my mother-in-law, Vivian Mercer. My boss looked surprised. "Your mother-in-law? Why would she try to damage your professional reputation?" I gave him a simplified version of the situation with Vivian, explaining her increasing interference in my marriage and career. To his credit, he took the matter seriously. "This crosses a line, Eleanor. It's one thing to meddle in family matters, but attempting to sabotage your professional standing is another entirely. Would you like us to pursue this further? We could file a harassment complaint." "Not yet," I said after consideration. "I need to address this within my family first, but I would appreciate documentation of the call and the allegations made." Armed with this concrete evidence of Vivian's malicious intent, I planned to finally confront the situation directly with Daniel. But when I arrived home that evening, I found him upset about something entirely different. "The investment account has been compromised," he said as soon as I walked in. "Someone attempted to transfer a significant amount to an offshore account this morning." My first thought was identity theft. "Did you call the bank? Have they frozen the account?" "Yes, they caught it before the transfer went through." He ran a hand through his hair. "But here's the strange part. Whoever did this had all our security information, account numbers, passwords, even the answers to security questions." A cold realization began to form. Which account was it? The joint one. The one with most of our savings and investment portfolio. The account that was in both our names, but that Daniel primarily managed. The account that contained not only our savings, but the inheritance I had received after my father died. "I think we should check the house for signs of intrusion," I said quietly. "Someone may have been in our home." We went through the house methodically, looking for evidence of a break-in. Nothing seemed disturbed until we reached my office. There, in the bottom drawer of my desk, we found several financial documents that should have been in our fireproof safe, the combination to which only Daniel and I knew. "How did these get here?" Daniel asked, bewildered. I didn't answer immediately, mentally reviewing who had access to our home, who might have had opportunity to search for these documents, who would benefit from creating financial chaos in our marriage. "Daniel," I said carefully, "when was the last time your mother was here alone?" His head snapped up. "You can't possibly think my mother would try to steal from us." "Not steal," I clarified. "Create confusion. Create problems between us." "That's absurd, Ellie. Why would she do that?" "The same reason someone pretending to be from the Portland Housing Authority called my firm today to make false accusations about my professional conduct." I explained what had happened at work, showing him the documentation my boss had provided. Daniel listened, his expression shifting from disbelief to uncertainty. "This could be a coincidence," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Daniel, I think your mother is deliberately trying to damage both my career and our marriage. These aren't isolated incidents." I showed him my documented list of Vivian's interferences and boundary violations over the past year. Seeing them compiled chronologically seemed to shake him. "This is A lot, he admitted. But it doesn't prove she tried to access our accounts or called your firm. You're right, I acknowledge. We don't have absolute proof. But think about who had access to our home, who might have searched for financial information, who has consistently tried to create problems between us. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I need time to think about this. It's a serious accusation, Ellie. I nodded, understanding his position. Accepting what I was suggesting would mean re-evaluating his entire relationship with his mother. It wasn't something he could do instantly, no matter how compelling the evidence. What neither of us knew was that the final, irrefutable proof of Vivian's manipulation was about to present itself in a way that would make denial impossible. 3 days after the investment account incident, I had to make a quick overnight trip to Portland for the project's final client presentation. Daniel offered to drive me to the airport. Are you sure you're comfortable with me going? I could send one of the junior architects. I offered, concerned about leaving while things were still unresolved between us. No, you should be there for the culmination of your project, he said. Besides, I need some time to process everything we discussed. As he helped me with my luggage, Daniel seemed distracted. What are you thinking? I asked. He sighed. I called the bank yesterday, asked them if they could trace the attempted transfer. And the request came from an IP address associated with my mother's internet service provider. His voice was flat. It's not definitive proof, but... I squeezed his hand. I'm sorry, Daniel. I know this is painful. I'm going to talk to her while you're gone, he decided. Not accuse her, just ask some questions. See how she responds. Though concerned about this approach, I recognized Daniel needed to reach his own conclusions. Be careful, was all I said. My presentation in Portland went exceptionally well. The clients were thrilled with the final design, and the project was officially deemed a success. Under normal circumstances, I would have been elated, but my thoughts were with Daniel and whatever conversation he might be having with Vivian. I tried calling him that evening, but the call went to voicemail. A text received a brief response. Everything's fine. Talk tomorrow. The uncharacteristic terseness worried me, but I had an early flight and needed sleep. I arrived home the following afternoon to find the house quiet. Daniel's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the living room or kitchen. Calling his name, I made my way upstairs and found him sitting in my office, staring at an open laptop. Daniel, is everything okay? He looked up, his expression a complex mixture of anger and grief. No, nothing is okay. He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was an email account I didn't recognize, open to a series of messages between Vivian and someone named R. Jenkins. Read them, Daniel said quietly. The emails dated back nearly 2 years, beginning shortly after our engagement. In them, Vivian discussed her concerns about me with an old family friend who appeared to be a private investigator. She had hired him to conduct a background check on me, seeking any information that might help Daniel see the truth about his hasty decision. As the correspondence continued, her requests became more explicit. She asked Jenkins to look for evidence of prior relationships, financial irregularities, or academic dishonesty. Anything that might cast doubt on my character. When these investigations yielded nothing significant, her frustration was evident. There must be something we're missing. She wrote 6 months into our marriage. No one is this perfect. Keep looking. After I began the Portland project, the emails took a darker turn. Vivian discussed creating situations that would highlight the strain my career was putting on our marriage. She mentioned borrowing items from our home to examine, including financial documents and personal correspondence. Most damning were the recent emails discussing the false complaint to my firm and the attempted financial transfer, both explicitly described as efforts to create crises that would force me to re-evaluate my priorities. Where did you find these? I asked, feeling numb. I went to talk to her yesterday, as I said I would. She was oddly nervous, kept checking her phone. When she went to the kitchen to make tea, I noticed her laptop was open. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I've never invaded my mother's privacy before, but something felt wrong. When I saw these emails open on her screen, he shook his head. I forwarded them to myself. I needed proof. I needed to be sure. I sat beside him, processing the magnitude of what we discovered. Vivian hadn't just been interfering in our marriage. She had been systematically trying to undermine it from the very beginning. What happened after you saw the emails? I asked. I left, told her I wasn't feeling well. I couldn't confront her, not right then. I needed to show you first. He turned to me, his eyes haunted. I've been sitting here for hours, reading them over and over, trying to understand how the woman who raised me could do this. I placed my hand over his. She loves you, Daniel. In her way. She just couldn't accept sharing you with someone else. That's not love, he said bitterly. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't try to destroy what makes someone happy. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between us. What do we do now? I finally asked. We confront her, Daniel said firmly. Together. No more divided and conquered. She needs to know that her behavior is unacceptable, and that we're a united front. I agreed, but the prospect of facing Vivian with this knowledge was daunting. We decided to invite her to our home the following evening, not giving her any indication of what we wanted to discuss. When Vivian arrived, she was all smiles and affection, embracing Daniel warmly and offering me a perfunctory hug. She had brought dessert, an elaborate chocolate tort that she knew was Daniel's favorite. To celebrate Eleanor's project completion, she said, though she had never before acknowledged my professional accomplishments. We made small talk through dinner, Daniel maintaining remarkable composure given what we knew. It wasn't until we moved to the living room with coffee that he finally broached the subject. Mom, we need to talk about something serious, he began. Something disturbing that's come to our attention. Vivian's smile faltered slightly. That sounds ominous. What's wrong, darling? I saw your emails to Robert Jenkins, Daniel said directly. I know what you've been doing. The change in Vivian's demeanor was immediate and striking. The warm maternal facade vanished, replaced by a defensive rigidity. You went through my private correspondence, she demanded, ignoring the substance of his statement. The emails were open on your laptop, Daniel replied. But that's hardly the point. You hired a private investigator to dig into Eleanor's past. You deliberately created problems between us. You tried to sabotage her career and our finances. Vivian's eyes narrowed. I was protecting you. You rushed into this marriage without considering the consequences. I needed to be sure she wasn't taking advantage of you. Taking advantage? I interjected. In what way? I have my own career, my own money. I've never asked Daniel for anything but partnership and respect. Precisely, Vivian exclaimed, as if I'd made her point. This modern partnership, where you're both so independent, where you put your career ahead of my son's needs, that's not a real marriage. Daniel deserves someone who will prioritize him, create a proper home. I love your son, I said quietly. I support his dreams and goals, just as he supports mine. That is a real marriage. You're never here. Vivian's composure was cracking, always flying off to Portland, leaving him alone. He was raised to expect a wife who's present, who understands family obligations. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, stop. These are your expectations, not mine. I've never felt neglected or unsupported by Eleanor. The only strain in our marriage has come from your constant interference. Interference. I've been looking out for your interests when you were too infatuated to see clearly. She turned to me, mask fully dropped now. You have no idea what it takes to be part of this family. The Mercers have traditions, expectations. Daniel is my only child, my husband's legacy. I won't let you reshape him into someone who neglects his family heritage. This isn't about family heritage, Daniel said warily. This is about control. You couldn't accept that I found someone to love who wasn't you. Vivian recoiled as if slapped. That's disgusting. How dare you suggest? I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, Daniel clarified. I'm saying you've refused to accept that I could love someone else, that I could build a life with Eleanor. That's different from what you envisioned. That's not protecting me. It's controlling me. Vivian's face flushed red. Everything I've done has been for your own good. She's changed you, pulled you away from your family, your roots. No, Mom. Eleanor has supported me in becoming more fully myself. It's you who wanted me to remain frozen in the role of devoted son, with no other meaningful relationships. He reached for my hand, a gesture that didn't escape Vivian's notice. We're a team, a partnership. That doesn't diminish what you and I had. But it is different, and you need to accept that. Accept it. Vivian gave a brittle laugh. Accept watching you throw away everything I raised you to value. For what? So she can drag you across the country whenever her precious career demands it. I remained calm despite the attack. Vivian, the Portman project was temporary. I took it because it aligned with my professional goals, just as Daniel pursues projects that matter to him. We support each other's ambitions. That's what marriage means to us. How convenient for you, she snapped. All the benefits of marriage with none of the sacrifice. In my day. This isn't your day anymore, Daniel interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. And it's not your marriage, it's ours. The finality in his tone seemed to penetrate Vivian's defenses. For a moment, the anger drained from her face, replaced by something more vulnerable. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that her machinations had backfired spectacularly. What are you saying? She asked, her voice suddenly small. Daniel sighed deeply. I'm saying that things need to change. We can't continue like this. Your actions, hiring a private investigator, calling Eleanor's firm with false accusations, attempting to access our finances, these aren't just boundary violations, they're potentially criminal. Criminal. Vivian looked genuinely shocked. I was trying to protect our family. By committing fraud, by attempting to damage Eleanor's professional reputation, by trying to create financial chaos in our marriage. Daniel shook his head. Mom, I love you. You're my mother and always will be. But this behavior has to stop. Completely and permanently. Or what? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Or we'll have no choice but to distance ourselves from you, he said quietly. Completely. The room fell silent as the ultimatum hung in the air. I squeezed Daniel's hand, proud of his clarity and strength, but aware of how difficult this confrontation must be for him. Vivian looked between us, perhaps searching for a crack in our united front. Finding none, her expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. I see she's turned you against me completely, she said, rising to her feet. When this marriage inevitably falls apart, don't expect me to welcome you back with open arms. You've made your choice, Daniel. This isn't about choosing between you and Eleanor, Daniel replied. It's about establishing healthy boundaries that you've repeatedly refused to respect. Vivian gathered her purse, her movements rigid with suppressed fury. I've only ever wanted what's best for you. Someday you'll understand that. What's best for me is being married to the woman I love without constant interference and manipulation, Daniel said. If you can't accept that, then we have nothing more to discuss. Vivian paused at the door, turning back with one final barb. She'll never love you the way I do. No one could. After she left, Daniel and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the confrontation and its implications. I'm sorry, he finally said. I knew she could be difficult, but I never imagined this. You have nothing to apologize for, I assured him. You didn't cause her behavior. But I enabled it. All those times I dismissed your concerns, made excuses for her. You ran a hand over his face. I should have seen it sooner. She's your mother. You loved and trusted her. That's not a character flaw, Daniel. He nodded slowly. What happens now? It was a question without easy answers. The confrontation had been necessary but painful, and the path forward was uncertain. One thing, however, was clear. We have faced Vivian's manipulations together and emerged stronger for it. In the days following our confrontation with Vivian, Daniel and I experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally in the open. Grief for the relationship we had hoped to have with her. Anger at her deliberate attempts to undermine our marriage. And uncertainty about what would come next. Daniel struggled the most, alternating between periods of quiet introspection and bursts of indignation as he continued to process the depth of his mother's deception. I keep thinking about all those emergencies that mysteriously occurred whenever you returned from Portland, he said one evening as we sat on our back porch. How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind, I countered gently. You were being a good son. Vivian exploited your compassion and loyalty. I let her come between us, he insisted. All those times I defended her behavior, dismissed your concerns. We're past that now, I reminded him. What matters is where we go from here. Where we went initially was to therapy. Daniel suggested it first, recognizing that we needed professional guidance to navigate the aftermath of Vivian's interference and to strengthen our communication. Dr. Reeves, a marriage counselor specializing in family dynamics, helped us process what had happened and establish healthier patterns moving forward. She also provided Daniel with resources for understanding and setting boundaries with a controlling parent. What your mother did reflects her issues. Not any failure on your part, she told him during one session. You can love her while still acknowledging the harm her behavior caused and taking steps to protect yourself and your marriage. As for Vivian herself, we had no contact for nearly 2 months after the confrontation. Daniel was firm in his decision to maintain distance until she acknowledged her actions and demonstrated genuine remorse. I supported his choice while remaining open to reconciliation if and when the time was right. The silence was broken by a brief email from Vivian to Daniel. I miss you. Can we talk? He showed me the message, his expression troubled. What do you think? I think that's your decision, I said carefully, but if you do meet with her, be clear about your expectations and boundaries. Daniel arranged to meet his mother at a coffee shop. Neutral territory. When he returned home, he looked emotionally drained but resolute. She started with the usual deflection, he reported. I only wanted what was best for you. A mother knows these things. But when I made it clear that I wouldn't accept those excuses, she finally admitted that she had gone too far. Did it seem genuine? He considered the question. Partially. I think she genuinely regrets the outcome, losing her relationship with me. I'm less certain she fully understands why her actions were wrong. What happens now? I told her that if she wants to be part of our lives, there are conditions. No unannounced visits. No interference in our marriage or decisions. And most importantly, she needs to treat you with genuine respect and acceptance. He paused. I also suggested she consider therapy to work through her attachment issues. How did she respond to that? About as well as you'd expect, he said with a wry smile. But she did agree to try. She's afraid of losing me completely, and that's a powerful motivator. The rebuilding of trust was a slow, uneven process. We established clear boundaries with Vivian, including structured visits and limited personal information sharing. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns threatened to re-emerge, but with time and consistent reinforcement, a new dynamic gradually took shape. 6 months after our confrontation, we invited Vivian to dinner at our home. It was a tentative step toward a more normal relationship, one with appropriate boundaries and expectations. The evening was somewhat stiff but civil. Vivian made visible efforts to engage with me directly, asking thoughtful questions about my current projects and offering genuine congratulations when I mentioned my recent promotion. As she was preparing to leave, she paused at the door. "The house looks lovely. You've done wonderful things with it, Eleanor." Coming from Vivian, this simple acknowledgement of my role in creating our home felt significant. It wasn't an explicit apology for her past behavior, but it was a small recognition of my legitimate place in Daniel's life. "Thank you, Vivian," I replied. "That means a lot." Our relationship with Vivian would never be uncomplicated or entirely comfortable, but with clear boundaries and consistent expectations, we established a workable dynamic that allowed Daniel to maintain a connection with his mother while protecting our marriage from her interference. And there were unexpected benefits to weathering this storm together. Daniel and I emerged from the experience with stronger communication skills and a deeper understanding of each other's needs and priorities. The challenge had forced us to define and articulate what we valued in our relationship, creating a more resilient foundation for our future. A year after our confrontation with Vivian, we had news that would test the new boundaries we had established. I was pregnant. We debated how and when to tell Vivian, aware that a grandchild would introduce new complexities to our carefully managed relationship. "She'll want to be involved," Daniel acknowledged, "probably more than we'll be comfortable with." "Then we established clear expectations from the beginning," I said, "just like we've been doing." When we shared the news, Vivian's initial reaction was precisely what we anticipated. Immediate excitement followed by a flood of suggestions about everything from nursery design to childcare arrangements. But when Daniel gently reminded her of our boundaries, she caught herself. "Of course," she said, visibly reeling in her enthusiasm. "This is your child. I'm just happy to be included." It was a small moment, but it represented significant progress. Vivian was learning, however reluctantly, to recognize and respect the boundaries of our family unit. Our daughter, Lily, was born the following spring, a beautiful, healthy baby who immediately captured our hearts. Vivian, to her credit, maintained the boundaries we had established, asking permission before visiting and following our parenting decisions without comment, at least in our presence. Watching her with Lily, I occasionally glimpsed the loving woman Daniel had described from his childhood. Attentive, affectionate, genuinely invested in another person's well-being. In those moments, I could almost understand how her love for her son had twisted into something controlling and possessive. Not excuse it, certainly, but understand the human vulnerability at its core. For Daniel, becoming a father provided a new perspective on his relationship with Vivian. "I love Lily with everything I am," he told me one night as we watched our daughter sleep. "But I want her to become her own person, to build her own life. I can't imagine trying to control who she loves or what she chooses." "That's because you're a healthy parent," I said, leaning against his shoulder. "You love her without needing to possess her." He nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand my mother better now, even if I don't condone what she did. Her fear of losing me was real. Misplaced and destructive, but real. 3 years have passed since we confronted Vivian about her hidden agenda. Our relationship with her is not perfect, but it is functional, defined by clear boundaries that she largely respects. Daniel has found a balance between being a loving son and a protective husband and father, and I have made peace with the knowledge that Vivian may never fully embrace me as the partner she would have chosen for her son. What matters more is that Daniel and I have built the partnership we wanted, supportive, respectful, and aligned in our priorities and values. We navigate challenges together, whether they come from external pressures like Vivian's interference or the normal stresses of balancing careers and family. If there's wisdom I can offer from this experience, it's this. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong in a relationship. Document patterns of behavior that concern you. Communicate openly with your partner about your observations and feelings. And most importantly, present a united front when addressing interference from family members or others. Difficult in-law relationships are common, but they don't have to undermine your marriage. With clear boundaries, consistent communication, and professional support when needed, you can protect your partnership while still maintaining family connections, even with those who once sought to come between you. In the end, Vivian's hidden agenda didn't destroy our marriage as she had hoped. Instead, it strengthened our commitment to each other and clarified what truly matters in our relationship. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that her attempts to separate us ultimately brought us closer together, more certain than ever that we had chosen the right partner in each other. Epilogue. Last weekend, we celebrated Lily's 3rd birthday with a small gathering in our backyard. Vivian was there, of course, bearing an elaborate gift and offering to help with the preparations. But unlike in the past, she asked where things should go rather than rearranging them to her liking. She complimented the cake I had baked instead of bringing her own just in case. Small victories, perhaps, but meaningful ones. As I watched her interact with Lily, showing genuine interest in our daughter's enthusiastic explanations of her new toys, I reflected on how far we had come. The woman who had once viewed me as a threat to her relationship with Daniel was now, if not exactly a friend, at least a respectful co-participant in our family life. Later, as Daniel and I cleaned up after the party, he paused, a pile of wrapping paper in his hands. "You know, I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For not giving up on us, on our marriage. It would have been easier to walk away when things got difficult with my mother." I smiled, remembering the uncertainty and pain of those early days. Easier, maybe, but not better. What we have was worth fighting for. He nodded, pulling me into an embrace. It still is. And that, ultimately, is the lesson in our story. Relationships, whether marriages, families, or friendships, require vigilance and care. They can be threatened by hidden agendas, unspoken expectations, and the complex emotions that bind us to those we love. But with courage, clarity, and commitment, they can also withstand these challenges, emerging stronger and more resilient for having faced them. Vivian's hidden agenda failed because our commitment to each other proved more powerful than her attempts to undermine it. And in that realization lies hope for anyone facing similar challenges in their own relationships. Trust your instincts, hold firm to what you value, and remember that love, when it's healthy and true, creates space for growth rather than trying to confine or control. That's the truth that finally unfolded for us, and it has made all the difference.